The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
Fate leads the willing and drags along the reluctant. A 2,000-year-old nugget of wisdom from the Stoic philosopher Seneca. Rapidly unfolding biosphere implosion continues to push power structure desperation and propaganda, and power structure controlled U.S. corporate media continues to rant about all the propaganda the North Koreans are fed by their government. Quote, from cradle to grave, as one CNN correspondent recently stated. Does that sound familiar? The sheer immensity of the lies fed to the American population by the criminal cabal masquerading as our government staggers the imagination. Unfortunately, like the North Koreans, the vast majority of the U.S. population is so far all too willing to accept the power structure propaganda that's dished up to them day in and day out. Let's consider a few dire examples. Vaccines are good for you. Fluoride in your drinking water is good for you. And being sprayed with pesticides is good for you. And on that last point, as I made mention of in my last broadcast, the recent cyclone manipulation has facilitated extensive flooding, which in turn has opened up the door for U.S. military deployment of massive aerial chemical spraying C-130s to blanket spray U.S. civilians. This is going on now. Why is there no outrage from the American population, even from those being sprayed with these proven toxic insecticides, and who can say what else? More on that later in this broadcast. This is Dane Wigington. You're listening to the Global Alert News Hour for September 16th, 2017. This weekly Global Alert News Hour is commercial free, brought to you by geoengineeringwatch.org. Again, this is the news you may not want to hear, but that you need to know. This program is broadcast throughout Northern California on 1670 AM, 104.9 FM, and 105.7 FM. Global Alert News is also broadcast on the East Coast by the PRN radio network at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. I'll get to headlines of planet Earth under siege in a moment. A couple quick announcements. Orchard Nutrition has free informational materials supplied by geoengineeringwatch.org. If you're in the Redding or Shasta County area, you can get information on the ongoing climate engineering insanity, the real story on 9/11 from 3,000 architects and engineers, or the lethal vaccination issue, all of which we must need to educate ourselves on if we're to have any chance of long-term survival. And that's a mathematical fact. Orchard Nutrition, again, in Redding, California, has those materials. If you'll promise to put them to use, we'll try to keep supplying them as long as we can. Announcement for Gym Fair, the Gym Fair event. Gym Fair is a major event at the Marin this weekend, happening now at the Marin Center Exhibition Hall in San Rafael, California. Geoengineeringwatch.org, full information booth there, free materials there as well. 20-page color booklets, DVDs, flyers. Gym Fair has been a staunch and unyielding supporter of the attempt to expose and halt climate engineering. So if you're in the San Rafael area, go to the Marin Center Exhibition Hall and visit the booth, get some free materials, help to share with others this incredibly critical issue of climate engineering on which all else depends. The greatest and most immediate threat we face, short of nuclear cataclysm. Find out why that's true. Moving on, the anniversary of 9/11 has come and gone. How many self-proclaimed patriotic Americans even care that this blatant false flag event, a demolition of the World Trade Towers, 3 of them, not just 2, and this event clearly carried out by elements of our own government, that's inarguable. How many so-called patriotic Americans even care that nearly 3,000 of the world's top architects and engineers from around the world are risking their careers and likely much more to state on the record that the official narrative on 9/11 is a blatant, glaring lie? How many self-proclaimed American patriots remember a true American hero, Pat Tillman, who gave up so much to join the U.S. military after 9/11, only to discover the depths of deception and tyranny that thrived there in the U.S. military? And Tillman was soon executed by elements of our own military to shut him up. All of his belongings and writings were burned by our military. And those who want an example of a true patriot, do some real research on Pat Tillman and what our military did to him and his family to try to shut them up as well. That's what's going on in the U.S. military. So for all those who claim to have joined the U.S. military for the right reasons, that's not enough. It's not enough. If you continue to go along with the insanity as a blind, unquestioning order follower, you're a part of the problem. We don't have time to wait any longer for you to act accordingly, to fulfill your oath of protecting your population from all threats, foreign and domestic. A very dark cancer is at the head of the U.S. military and others around the globe. I'm not just singling out our military, but our military is the biggest and the most destructive by far on the planet right now. And our military is the one that is pushing toward World War III out of sheer desperation because they have no other options left to continue their juggernaut of insanity. They must have global conflict. Don't be a part of that. Our military brothers and sisters and countless other individuals and countless industries must choose to stand up and do the right thing now, or we won't have tomorrow. It's that simple. That's a mathematical fact. An update on the coming 5G insanity. Let's ask ourselves this: why the power structure is pushing so hard for the rapid saturation of extremely dangerous 5G transmission sites to be installed from coast to coast. 5G frequencies that are also used for crowd control weapons by the U.S. military and others. We must all help to sound the alarm on this issue and all the radio frequency dangers, immense dangers. Electrosmog is saturating the entire planet, not just killing us and causing cancers in us, but the entire web of life, which is electrical in nature, inarguably. Skies over Northern California continue to be anything and everything but blue. And for all those who tell themselves it's always just smoke from some distant fire that makes the air filthy day in and day out, you're wrong. Yes, there's fires in the state, many. And yes, smoke is in the air. But the filthy air also contains copious amounts of highly toxic nanoparticulates from the relentless climate engineering solar radiation management spray dispersions. How can we say this for certain? Any examination of satellite imagery, which we do at geoengineeringwatch.org every single day, proves beyond any reasonable doubt that much of what clogs up and taints our skies is the blow-in from massive climate engineering spraying and grid patterns that can be seen blanketing the eastern Pacific Ocean off the U.S. West Coast every single day. This spraying bombardment goes on as the climate engineers desperately try to shade the Pacific with toxic particles to form a canopy of artificial cloud cover. This is marine layer enhancement, a form of climate engineering, a form of solar radiation management. Everything they spray blows inland and thus contaminates every breath we take. Is it any wonder at all that every other commercial on corporate media is for allergies and asthma, which most of the population now seems to have? And how few even stop to wonder why? How few? And about the forest fires, here's a headline from the LA Times. Wildfires continue to wreak havoc across the West. And what's the single greatest factor fueling the incineration of our forests? Global climate engineering programs. Single greatest factor. And though anthropogenic or human-caused global warming is absolutely real, and there are countless causes, climate engineering creates the single greatest causal factor behind the global forest fire apocalypse. Why? Geoengineering disrupts the hydrological cycle, the rain cycle. It toxifies soils and thus forest root systems with bioavailable heavy metals like aluminum. Peer-reviewed studies on this, by the way. Stops nutrient uptake for those organisms. They shut down nutrient uptake. This kills off the root systems and thus inhibits, as I stated, nutrient uptake. Climate engineering is destroying also the ozone layer. All you have to do to verify this, just search this online. You can search climate engineering destroys the ozone layer. You can search geoengineeringwatch.org, climate engineering destroying ozone layer. Just search the relevant terms and you'll find hard data, but you have to research in order to find this data. Not asking you to believe anything I say. Geoengineering, by destroying the ozone layer, releases, of course, extreme UV radiation on forests and us as well. The extreme UV radiation scorches and kills the foliage, in addition to killing and burning the Cambrian layers off the trunk and branches of the bark of the tree, if you will. And this is not hard to see. All over the world, Depends on the species, depends on its exposure, depends on the particular resilience of a particular specimen of that species. But this is easy to find. Look for the south-southwest facing side of trees in the northern hemisphere, and you will find lots of them with the bark literally scorched off the tree. And anyone who says this is normal or natural is simply lying or completely ignorant of a subject that they perhaps claim to know about. This is, again, part of the effect of climate engineering on the forest. Finally, 2 more points. The ionizing of the atmosphere from these particulates, making the atmosphere more electrically conductive. This in turn creates much more dry lightning. Last point, the heavy metal particulates associated with climate engineering, like aluminum, are incendiaries. This incendiary dust settles down in the foliage and thus makes it more flammable. So for those that have bought the lie that the drought in California is over, or that the only thing killing the trees is the beetles, time to wake up. And the recently labeled flash drought condition that has parched the West, pushing the forest fuel moistures to record low levels. We're not being told this. We're being told the drought is over. That's a lie. Just because the reservoirs are full, again, doesn't mean the forest is doing fine. And for the record, again, to avoid any misinterpretations, I am not saying and have never said that global warming is not real. I've never said that global warming is not a factor with the forest die-off and the burn down of the forest. I've never said that climate engineering was the only causal factor behind global warming or the forest fires. What I'm saying is that in the case of the northern latitude forest fires, climate engineering should be considered the single greatest factor. We must always remember and consider that the rapidly unfolding biosphere collapse is a complex scenario. There are many factors, and any form of human activity that damages the biosphere, the climate, and thus the energy balance of the planet must be considered in the equation. On that note, here's something else to consider and remember. How long can you hold your breath? Here's a headline. O2, oxygen, dropping faster than CO2 is rising. Something we don't hear much about, do we? From this report, new research shows oxygen depletion in the atmosphere. At geoengineeringwatch.org, by the way, we've reported on this for a very long time. Now mainstream media is having to cover it. Why? Because they can't hide it any longer. That's why. Again, new research shows oxygen depletion in the atmosphere accelerating since 2003, coinciding with the biofuels boom. And keep in mind, none of these mainstream reports will mention climate engineering. And aside from the particles that are being scattered in the atmosphere, which consume oxygen when they oxidize, and the countless jet aircraft that are burning up immense amounts of oxygen, releasing immense amount of CO2 by deploying all these particles into the atmosphere, none of this will ever be mentioned or considered by mainstream articles. But let's remember that as we're reading these articles and add it into the equation ourselves. So it says the accelerating of oxygen depletion since 2003, coinciding with the biosphere's boom, climate policies, wishful thinking on my part. Climate policies that focus exclusively on carbon sequestration could be disastrous for all oxygen-breathing organisms, including humans. That's a big category, isn't it? The simultaneous decrease in ocean oxygen not only threatens the survival of aerobic marine organisms, but is symptomatic of the slowdown of the ocean's thermohaline conveyor, the Gulf Stream circulation system that transports heats from the tropics to the poles, overturns surface layers, pushing those warm surface layers into the deep ocean and vice versa, redistributing nutrients and gases for the ocean biosphere and regulating rainfall and temperatures on land masses. This dynamical system is highly non-linear, and small changes could make it fail altogether. This would in turn trigger disastrous runaway effects on the climate, and more importantly, it could wipe out the ocean's phytoplankton that's ultimately responsible for splitting water to regenerate oxygen for the entire biosphere on land and in the sea. Very simple. No plankton, no people. No trees, no people. No ozone layer, no people. Tree populations globally down 55% since the dawn of civilization. The 45% that's left is dead and dying rapidly. Plankton populations globally down 60% and dying rapidly. We are on the fast track to a lifeless planet if we continue on the current course. Please remember that. How's terrestrial wildlife doing? We see the ocean life is not doing well at all. Oceans are imploding around the globe. We're heading for Canfield Ocean, dead, lifeless, stratified, oxygenless oceans. Terrestrial life. Here's a report from Canada. Here's the headline. Quote, exceptionally serious. Report says half of Canadian wildlife declining. And that doesn't even tell the whole story. But from this report, an extensive survey of 903 species of Canadian birds, fish, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians over more than 4 decades found that half of them are in serious population decline. Declining species lost a total of 83% of their numbers between 1970 and 2014, says the report released on Thursday by the World Wildlife Fund. Species protected by federal legislation shrank nearly as quickly. So as everything dies off, any funding to protect them also goes away. And when people hear that species are declining, as this report stated, they might think 10, 15, 20%. How about 83%? And how about again that we're losing to extinction every single day nearly 300 species of plant, animal, and insect. How many people know or care? And when you report data like this, how many people roll their eyes, say doom and gloom with a sort of marginalizing tone, and ram their head in the sand? And it's those kinds of people that are in so many ways responsible for the dark corner we now find ourselves in, an unwillingness to face the truth, a desire to simply stay in a bubble until the last possible moment. Don't be one of those people. Refuse to become one of them, no matter what comes. Don't join their ranks. I want to elaborate on one point mentioned in this Canadian report of wildlife decline. The example is this. They state that there isn't much that can be done to halt the slow disappearance of the Pacific killer whales until scientists understand why Chinook salmon, the orca's main food, are declining. Isn't it amazing how our so-called experts don't seem to know anything about anything? The entire science meteorological community can't and won't recognize or acknowledge the climate engineering atrocities, the glaring elephant in the skies that are going on over our heads every single day. And I recognize that's a bad career decision for them. I recognize there's gag orders on federal scientists. But at what point does a person find their backbone, join together with others, and stand up and tell the truth while there's still something left to salvage? We live in entire communities of academicians that are simply either one of two things. They're either grossly incompetent of the position they claim to be an expert in, or they're lying. Take your pick. So here again with the Pacific killer whales, the scientists claim not to understand why Chinook salmon are declining. Here's a few headlines on that point. First, the collapse of Chinook salmon run threatens wild native tribes. No surprise. Main staple food source. Second, collapse. Hundreds of millions of Pacific salmon presumed dead. They're missing. We can only assume they're dead, correct? Third headline, Pacific steelhead populations, decades-long collapse occurring now. Fourth headline, collapse at salmon farm renews debate about fish farming. And I'll get to that fourth headline in a moment, but in regard to the salmon collapse on the Pacific coast, how about one, there's massive amounts of aluminum coming down in the precipitation, which then in turn goes to the tributaries, which then in turn kills aquatic insects. As I've stated over and over, that's the fish food, by the way, insects, as they're fries in the native tributaries, the small fish. I've stated over and over, I work with former Forest Service biologist who has measured aquatic and terrestrial insect decline in Shasta-Siskiyou counties over the last 10 years, 90% decline. But the so-called currently employed experts can't seem to connect that dot. The massive UV radiation is heating surface waters radically, deoxygenating them, causing massive algae blooms, killing fish as well. The experts don't seem to plug that into the equation. Point after point after point, the so-called experts are paid to pacify populations until the last possible moment. It's up to us to stand up and force them to tell the truth, or they should be put on trial, just like in the Nuremberg scenario after World War II, for being a part of the cancer, a part of the crimes, a part of the carnage, criminality, and fueling global omnicide. In regard to the fourth headline I read a moment ago, collapse at salmon farm renews debate about fish farming. As I've stated on previous programs, the desperation of the human race to now try to make up for what nature is no longer providing for free. And fish farms are a stunning example of that. We now have to farm fish with way more resources than it took to just go catch them before. The fish is now, the genetically modified fish especially, not nutritious. Look it up. And it's incredibly toxic. And now we have these genetically modified frankenfish released to intermingle with what's left of the native fish populations. Everything industrialized society does, yet more consequences of the human race's complete disregard for the natural world and the web of life as a whole. Mass destruction from every direction. And how many people adamantly deny that? Nothing wrong with the planet, nothing wrong with the environment, nothing wrong with the climate. The propensity of the human race to deny reality, no matter how immediate the threat is truly perplexing. We should keep in mind that all of these headlines I just went over are only a sample of what's unfolding. We're already deeply immersed in Earth's sixth great mass extinction. This is an indisputed fact. Again, don't believe me, investigate it for yourself. More on the recently labeled flash drought scenario. Though it's historically unprecedented, it's now becoming the norm, thanks to climate engineering. Here's a headline. The unprecedented drought that's crippling Montana and North Dakota. From that report, it came without warning and without equivalent. Now a flash drought is fueling fires and hurting the lives of those who work the land. Why won't those people, those farmers, and those being hurt, and soon the populations who are going to markets that have empty shelves, what will it take to make them face reality? Because we've served up a lot of these agencies, ranching groups, farming groups, with data on climate engineering, and they simply choose to ignore it, even though it's directly and immediately affecting them. And this is, again, is the propensity toward denial of the human race must be overcome, or we have no chance. And it's up to all of us, again, to share credible data in order to reach this critical mass of awareness. It's up to all of us. From this report, again, on the flash drought, new term, climate engineering, the single greatest factor with that term as well, the desiccant particulates absorb and accrete all available atmospheric moisture. They disrupt the hydrological cycle. Thus, now we have flash drought. Again, from this report, this is unprecedented, says Tanya Franson of the National Weather Service in Glasgow, who obviously won't mention climate engineering either. A larger city just up the road from Fort Peck, this is in Montana or North Dakota, I assume. This is as dry as it's been in recorded history, and some of our recording stations have 100 years of data. A lot of people try to compare this to the previous years, but really, you just can't. It's that bad. Before I get to another headline, again, later in this broadcast, I'll cover where the deluge's massive record flooding has created the opposite effect and what might be occurring there with the power structure contaminating those now water-soaked regions, with what we need to ask ourselves. I'll get to that after more headlines. Here's a headline: a worsening water crisis in North Africa and the Middle East. And let's not forget this when we talk about those countries, that the U.S. NATO weather warfare programs have played a huge part in these drought catastrophes. And if you think the 150 plus countries that have U.S. bases on their soil allowed such occupation just to be nice and friendly to the U.S., think again. In one form or another, countries are brought to their knees and forced to allow U.S. occupation. That's how empires work. The covert weather warfare weapon has been a key component of U.S. so-called foreign policy, and that weather weapon is now absolutely, and has been, used against the American population. There's no question about this. Absolutely no question. We can speculate on all the motives behind these programs. We can pretend that it's just some benevolent effort for our common good. And how many times have I heard that from people who are completely in denial? Our government wouldn't do it if it wasn't for our good. What an incredibly naive notion at this point. And I know people, I hear this from people a lot that say, you sound angry. And I've commented about this before. Why wouldn't any rational person be angry at what's happening? Not just at what the power structure is doing, but at the lack of response from your fellow human being who seems to feel he has no responsibility, he or she, in doing their part to changing the course of the Titanic on which we're all currently passengers. What rational human being wouldn't be a little perturbed about the insane asylum we find ourselves in with a population that just wants to go along, no matter how far off the edge we're pushed. That has to change, or we have no chance, none. From this report on Africa, again, the Middle East and North Africa, already the most water-stressed region in the world, faces a worsening crisis in terms of its access to water in the decades to come. And by the way, in the current course, there will be no decades to come. Mathematical fact. We're facing total ozone layer collapse in less than a decade, and the temperature rises that are now occurring from methane filling the atmosphere will make much of the planet, if not most, uninhabitable in that amount of time, if we stay on the current course. Climate engineering, the single greatest threat we face. We must stop that first and allow the planet to respond. And on this note, how many people can feel, when you feel a cumulus cloud, a naturally formed cumulus cloud, big white puffy cloud that floats over the top of you and blocks the sun, immediate cool down, yes? But when you have this sprayed haze over you, it's immensely hot. Even the UV is even hotter. And this is quote-unquote solar radiation management. And by the way, solar radiation management destroys natural cloud cover. It decimates it. From every direction, climate engineering is pounding the nails into our collective coffins. We must bring it to light and to a halt. But back to the water crisis in Africa. Again, so much of it caused by climate engineering, as African countries, one after another, have allowed U.S. occupation, something that Libyan President Gaddafi was completely against and was rallying the African nation, or the African continent, and all the countries in Africa against. In addition to deciding not to use the U.S. dollar as a currency, Gaddafi had to be taken out. None of this is hard to see through. None of it. A country, final statement from this report, a country is water stressed when it cannot provide the minimum water supply to satisfy the essential needs of its population. Let's remember this as well. On a warming planet, and the planet is absolutely warming, there's no rational denial of this, it must rain more. The laws of physics make this clear. 7% more moisture for every degree C of warming. Yes, we have massive deluges and massive floods, but overall, atmospheric relative humidity has gone down since 1945 when geoengineering was first deployed, not up. How can this happen? The only way it can happen is an atmosphere filled with sun-blocking, light-scattering, desiccant particulates, and that is solar radiation management. And again, back to the incredibly in denial and really, at this point, the tyrannical circles of academia that are towing the line for the power structure, denying the reality of climate engineering. That's a complete betrayal. Academia is completely betraying not only the populations of the globe, the human populations, but the entire web of life. And again, I realize there's federal gag orders. For those that don't know this, federal gag order right now on all National Weather Service and all NOAA employees. I repeat this a lot because it's important people understand this. If you want to see that gag order, search geoengineeringwatch.org, federal gag order. You'll find it. Look for yourself. But in spite of the gag order, at what point does a human being, an academician that is claimed to follow a career for the greater good, at what point do they stand up and actually walk the walk instead of lying for the power structure? Because that's what's going on right now. And in regard to the state of the climate, those who feel academia has lied about the severity of climate damage, you're right. But the lies are in the opposite direction of what many have chosen to believe. The state of damage to the climate system is far worse, far more dire than any official agency or Al Gore has stated. And I have great disdain for Al Gore, by the way. As I state over and over again, Al Gore is a criminal, carbon credits are a sham, but reality is still reality. Climate is far more damaged. Our situation is far more dire and immediate than almost any yet understand. Climate engineering fueling the overall fire, toxifying the entire planet at the same time. Moving on. Just to consider these points again, what massive and completely unacknowledged part have the ongoing geoengineering weather warfare programs played in countless drought and flood cataclysms? You cannot discuss the state of the climate or any particular event without including the climate engineering assault. Can't have a legitimate discussion without including that. And again, geoengineering, single largest causal factor in regard to the radical increase in catastrophic fires globally. What domino effect do these forest fires cause? Let's get into that headline. Remember, when events like forest fires happen, it triggers many downstream cataclysms. Most people have no idea about this. Darkening snow in the Arctic. Here's a headline. Darkening snow in the Arctic, a positive feedback giving rise to more warming. Soot goes into the air, settles down in the polar regions, makes the ice dark. The ice then absorbs much more heat as opposed to reflecting it, speeding the ice melt, increasing the planetary warming overall. Same thing happening, another feedback loop with methane, which I comment about and cover over and over. Thawing tundra and thawing methane seabed deposits, methane hydrates, are releasing into the atmosphere, and that's covering the planet like a layer of glass. That's why nighttime low temperatures are rising twice as fast as daytime highs. Climate engineers, in the attempt to try to mask this from the public for as long as possible, are actually helping to fuel the fire, in addition to contaminating us. Again, I'll get to that near the end of this program as well. Another headline, what will happen to Indian subcontinent's 2 billion people as temperatures soar? And temperatures are soaring. Again, if you're in the eastern half of the continental U.S. and you've been under some engineered cool downs of late and you think the whole planet is the same as where you live, wake up. Again, eastern half of the lower 48, just over 1/2% of the Earth's surface area. Not much. Look around. Look further than your own window sill. From this report, one of the real riddles out there as regards the future effects of anthropogenic climate change, no mention of climate engineering again, is with regard to the inevitable mass migrations. The situation of the Indian subcontinent in particular really makes one wonder, where do 2 billion people go when the region they are living in becomes truly uninhabitable? It's happening right now. The refugee crisis will accelerate, and the conflicts are, in the end, simply a result of dwindling resources. All of it comes down to a dying planet and the power structures maneuvering toward conflict because it's the only card they have left to play. Reminder on this point for those in California, and that's where this broadcast centers as well. The drought in California is worse than ever, and again, I'm not referring to reservoir levels, but rather the dried out forests. And the U.S. Drought Monitor shows 0 drought in Northern California, and that's a complete lie. Again, to pacify the population, the majority of which are unfortunately still all too willing to ignore their own eyes and senses in exchange for the official narrative. That needs to change. Geoengineers virtually control the flow of rain. They decide who gets rain and who doesn't, how much rain falls, how toxic it is. The climate engineers completely control the spigot, and that's an absolute fact. We can see on radar precipitation maps that when they choose to blow apart precipitation with aerosol spraying and radio frequency microwave transmissions, that's exactly what they do. And it's exactly what they've done in California since the rain stopped this year, and since they made the headlines they wanted to make to put the population back to sleep. The drought's over, everything's fine, go back to sleep. Right back to the ridiculously resilient ridge over California, frying the state. We've been, where I live, about 100 degrees or more for 4 months straight. It's killing everything. Nighttime lows in early September were 91 degrees where I live on one case. All extremely hot. It's killing everything. So the bottom line is, and the reasons they do this are many. It's not just to make the state a target. It also is connected to what they're trying to do in the Arctic, to pin some of the cold air there, to cool the eastern U.S. There are many, many complicated factors involved here. I don't have time to go into that in this program. But the bottom line is the climate engineers are controlling and disrupting. That's a better term. They're disrupting Earth's life support systems completely. Another headline, blistering heat turned lots of Napa's wine grapes into raisins. These kinds of headlines are everywhere. I'm only giving a sample. From this report, temperatures over the Labor Day weekend reached unseasonably 110 degrees in parts of Northern California. Nice for a final beach day. Not really. That's a little too warm, and the beach has been cold because they're pumping the marine layer with aerosols there to keep the shore as cold as I mentioned earlier. Report continues. Winemakers weren't too thrilled because the oppressive heat withered their grapes into raisins, still clinging hopelessly to the vine. The San Francisco Chronicle reports that the area effectively got 3 straight days of triple-digit heat. The awful daytime temperatures didn't cool off enough at night. I just mentioned that, didn't I? Meaning around-the-clock dehydration for the fruits. And now, a year that looked like a promising average-yielding vintage is one where Napa Vineyard owners watch as much as half their crop literally shrivel up. Final quote from a winemaker. I've been making wine for 34 years, and I don't think Napa's ever seen this excessive heat at this stage of ripeness. No, everything's changing radically, rapidly. And that's another tool of deception the power structure uses. They try to put in some little piece of data to make people think certain events have happened before somewhere in the past. Not true. Part of the deception. Another headline. It's from the World Economic Forum. Listen closely. This all glues together. In 10 years, the world may not be able to feed itself. Let's read behind that headline a bit. The world doesn't have enough to feed itself right now. Right now. But those in power know, as long as they make the disaster look like it's maybe just over the next ridge, out on the horizon somewhere, people will still continue to do nothing. It's here. It's not off on the horizon. It's here. From this report, we've long known that we might reach a point where we have more people than the food to sustain them. By 2050, another glaring lie for the exact reasons I just outlined, the world's population is expected to reach 9.1 billion. We'll never get there, by the way. And the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization predicts that at that point, the world would need to produce 70% more food than today to feed all those people. That 2050 deadline is the one usually cited by scientists and organizations like Oxfam as the year the world will run out of food. We'll never get there. On the current trajectory, none of us will get there. The equation is as non-linear as it could be. Once the life support systems on the planet begin to break down completely, it happens at blinding speed, and it's happening now. We've lost 60% of Earth's wildlife populations in the last 40 years, while the human population has doubled. Do the math, and it's accelerating on all fronts. We don't have anywhere near till 2050. We don't have till 2025 on the current course before big shoes will drop. In fact, right now, that's why the power structure is maneuvering, because they know they can't hide the severity of what's unfolding from the population much longer. As desperately as the population wants to remain asleep, can't hide reality much longer. So expect some very desperate moves from the power structures we already see unfolding. Another headline, the Great Nutrient Collapse. Listen closely to this one, especially those who falsely claim CO2 is wonderful, the more the better. False claim, not just for the oceans, because CO2 is radically acidifying the oceans, one of the main reasons the oceans are dying, something the CO2 cheerleaders never mention, but also for plant food that is a major staple in the human diet. From this report, the atmosphere is literally changing the food we eat for the worse, and almost nobody is paying attention. The so-called junk food effect researchers had learned about in lab tests also appeared to be occurring in fields and forests around the world. Quote, every leaf and every grass blade on Earth makes more and more sugars as CO2 levels keep rising. Researchers stated in this report, we are witnessing the greatest injection of carbohydrates into the biosphere in human history, an injection that dilutes other nutrients in our food supply. What does all that mean? It means the increased CO2 is changing the molecular composition of plants in a very negative way, reducing their nutrition. This is happening with pollen, with bees, less protein in the pollen because of increased CO2. The notion that pumping up the CO2, especially at this rate, is good for anything is simply false. It's propagated by people who don't want to investigate, who don't want to take the entire equation into account. Again, just because CO2 is necessary doesn't mean the more the better. Water is necessary. Stick your head a few feet underwater and see how long you live. We have to use our sense of reason, not ideology, preconception, and bias. Final paragraph from this report. What that means for humans whose main food intake is plants is only just starting to be investigated. Researchers who dive into it will have to surmount obstacles like its low profile and slow pace, and a political environment where the word climate is enough to derail a funding conversation. Consider that as well. For all those who falsely claim that researchers get paid if they give dire climate or environmental reports, that is exactly false. They get fired. That's what happens. They get fired, especially now, especially with the new administration that's completely pulled out all the stops for willful destruction of any environmental protection. That's a fact. It's been bad all along. Obama, Clinton, Bush's, all the rest. They're all simply puppets in the play. But now it's at a new level. There's no rationally arguing that. Another headline, whether copious amounts of rain and snow are coming to wash the smoke away. Billings, Montana. Now, we're going from record heat, record dry, to snow. That's called weather whiplash, and it's from Climate Engineering. From this report, it was hard not to notice the smoke in Billings Wednesday morning. In fact, the smoke is so bad and thick at Billings that it actually is unhealthy to breathe. No surprise, we talked about that earlier. It's not just smoke. Not only in Billings, but an air quality alert covers the entire state of Montana. Plus, we also have a red flag warning, which remains in effect, fire danger warning. The critical fire conditions will exist that could cause more wildfires to break out. But don't worry, snow's coming. In fact, listen to this. Final sentence. I'm going to skip to the end of this. The National Weather Service has issued a winter weather advisory for most of the Front Range of the mountains all the way down to the southwest corner of the state. From record dry heat wildfires to snow. Again, weather whiplash. Spraying of toxic chemical ice nucleating elements into the clouds to create these conditions. Patented processes, chemical ice nucleation for weather modification. Now, in regard to what's being sprayed and who's financially involved, let's go into this slowly, and then we'll get to what's happening in Texas right now. In Florida, Governor Scott's undisclosed interest via the First Lady in Florida in Zika Mosquito Control Company, the people that have an interest in making sure they spray toxic chemicals on you. Florida Governor Rick Scott has an undisclosed financial interest in Zika Mosquito Control Company, which his wife, Florida First Lady Ann Scott, owns a multi-million-dollar stake through private investment firm she co-owns. The company is Mosquito Control Services, LLC. According to its website, this company is a fully certified team of mosquito control experts licensed throughout the Gulf Coast, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida. Governor Scott, final statement, signed an executive order allocating $26 million in state emergency funds for Zika preparedness, including mosquito abatement spraying. What an incredible conflict of criminal interest here. The governor of the state has a financial interest in the toxic spraying of chemicals over Florida residents. So it's not just Montana being sprayed with chemical ice nucleating agents. Florida, Zika virus, massive, aggressive, toxic programs there. I want to transition now to what I mentioned in last week's program, in the beginning of this program, the template that has been laid with the flooded regions to now toxify those areas even more than they already are. Headline, U.S. Air Force is spraying 6 million acres with chemicals in response to Hurricane Harvey. Amid statewide efforts to clean up the aftermath left by historic flooding caused by Hurricane Harvey, the Pentagon announced last week that it had dispatched C-130 sprayers from the Air Force Reserve's 910th Airlift Wing, in order to assist with recovery efforts in eastern Texas. However, these, quote, recovery efforts have little to do with rebuilding damaged structures or with the resettlement of evacuees. Instead, they're set to spray chemicals in order to help, quote, control pest insect populations, which they allege pose a health risk, quote, to rescue workers and residents of Houston. They're protecting us just like they did after 9/11, right? When they said it was all safe to go into the wreckage of 9/11, and how many first responders are dead and dying because our government and the EPA and every single official agency with every order follower in it criminally lied. Why aren't those people being held responsible? The same thing is happening right now over Texas. So it's not just our fluoridated water, our toxic vaccinations, and the completely toxic climate engineering insanity that's decimating the biosphere. We're spraying chemicals now publicly, openly over the population, and the population is doing nothing. Continuing from this report, I'm going to move and cover some data fast because I don't have a lot of time. I want to cover this. NALED's toxicity, not confined to mosquitoes. What a surprise. Not just bad for mosquitoes, bad for anything and everything. From the report, while the Pentagon has framed its efforts to, quote, assist as seeking to eliminate potential human health risks, the particular chemical it is using to control insect populations likely do more harm than good. What a surprise. According to the Air Force, the mosquito control protocol involves spraying the, quote, Environmental Protection Agency approved and regulated material, NALED, which the Air Force insists will not be used in amounts large enough to cause concern for human health, like Agent Orange wouldn't hurt the U.S. soldiers on the ground or the entire population. Lies, lies, more lies the population chooses to continue to accept. Report continues. However, the insecticide Naled, manufactured and sold by a strategic partner of Monsanto, no surprise, is currently banned in the European Union due to the unacceptable risk it presents to human health. Naled is a known neurotoxin in animals and humans, as it inhibits an enzyme essential to nerve function and communication, and has even been known to have caused paralysis. Mounting scientific evidence, including a recent Harvard study, has also pointed to Naled's responsibility for the mass die-off of North American bees. We have aluminum in that factor as well. We've already proven that. Just one day of Naled spraying in South Carolina killed more than 2.5 million bees last year. Report continues. Yet the most concerning consequence of Naled poses for human health is the chemical's ability to cross the placentia barrier, meaning that Naled freely crosses from mother to fetus. A study conducted at the University of Oslo found that Naled's breakdown product caused a 15% decrease in the brain size of newborn guinea pigs when their mothers were exposed to Naled for only 3 days during pregnancy. Doctors from Puerto Rico have also claimed that Naled harms fetuses. Puerto Rico, by the way, did not allow this spraying to occur there. Studies in the U.S. have also shown that pregnant women exposed to Naled had a 60% higher chance of having a child with an autism spectrum disorder. 60%. This is especially troubling given that the manufacturer of Naled, Sumitomo Chemical Corporation, is also the manufacturer of the mosquito larvicide Sumilarv, a chemical now believed to have been the real culprit behind the spike and burst effects in Brazil, originally attributed to Zika. And of course, we have the Florida governor with his company involved in that criminality as well. Moving on with the report. In addition, the Air Force's characterization of Naled as a, quote, EPA-approved and regulated material omits the important fact that the EPA is currently re-evaluating the chemical for safety. According to the EPA's website, quote, the EPA expects to issue a new human health and ecological risk assessment for Naled before the end of 2017. Not stopping their spraying in Texas, though, is it? Scientists and concerned citizens have noted that Naled will likely be banned, as the EPA found it to harm 22 of 28 endangered species exposed to, not to mention us. Final paragraph from this report. Agrochem Corporation pressures to keep Naled on the market. However, political pressure could keep it on the market. Such pressure was manifest in last year's Zika Vector Control Act, which passed the House but failed in the Senate and narrowly missed becoming law. If it had been passed, the act would have exempted mosquito control operations, just like the vaccination companies are exempted from liability as well. When will the population of this country connect the dots? Exempted mosquito control operations from environmental regulations and would have kept Naled on the market regardless of the EPA's decision. It also would have ended monitoring and limits to pesticide use. No monitoring and no limits. Is this picture hard to see? This is an all-out push for not just ecocide or genocide, but omnicide. When will the American population understand we are fighting for our lives right here, right now? Especially true if you happen to live in the Texas flood zone and you're being sprayed right now by U.S. military KC-130s, and you don't really know what's in that spray. What they're telling you is more than bad enough, Naled, but ultimately, do you really know? Do you know what's in a vial, a vaccination vial that's injected into you or your child's veins? You don't know. You do not know. You can tell yourself it's all well and good, but it's not. Final sentence from this report. Given Naled's wide use, the chemicals manufacturer and its strategic partner Monsanto will likely want to keep such a profitable product on the market, lest they face a mass drop in sales and revenue. Wouldn't want that. This is not about revenue ultimately. It's about something much darker, much, much darker, and as is the vaccination issue as well. We must wake up and face that fact. When we have presidential advisors like now deceased Brzezinski stating on the record, it's now much easier to kill 1 million people than to control them. We must put that into the equation. It's time to abandon the naivety. We must face reality. This is going on now from countless directions. On that note, do we really know what's being sprayed? Is it just NALED, as if that's not bad enough? Do we really know what's being seeded, sprayed, experimented with? When we have documented cases of the U.S. military experimenting on U.S. civilian populations, a couple dozen cases, and we can only speculate on what they do to other populations and what they've done to our own soldiers. What types of biological warfare may in fact be happening that we are completely unaware of? I'm going to give one example, and I'm not stating that we have proof to back this up, but I'm trying to point out what's possible and what's not even being considered and what populations are completely unaware of in the case of parasites, which are absolutely a potential form of bio-warfare. Here's a headline: Common cat parasites linked to angry outbursts in humans. University of Chicago researchers say a parasite commonly spread from cats to humans may play a role in impulsive aggression. Their research into the parasite Toxoplasma gondii is part of their broader effort to improve diagnosis and treatment of people with recurrent bouts of extreme anger, such as road rage. Now, what people don't understand, this is a waterborne parasite as well. Just stating the possibilities. Another headline to go with this: effects of Toxoplasma on human behavior. And listen to the percentage of the population that's already been infected. And this is a waterborne pathogen as well. I want to make sure that's understood. Toxoplasma gondii is the most common protozoal parasite in developed nations. Following the initial acute phase of infection, the parasite assumes a latent form. Listen to this: up to 80% of the population may be infected, depending on eating habits and exposure. The dormant form of Toxoplasmosis gondii is found predominantly in nervous and muscle tissues in infected hosts. Until recently, latent infections in humans were assumed to be asymptomatic. And listen to this next statement, which came from Scientific American. Recently, however, evidence has been mounting that suggests the psychological consequences of infection are much darker than we once thought. What does this parasite do to rats? It makes them unafraid of their primary foe, a cat, unafraid. And it has very profound effects on the human brain as well, and up to 80% of the population is infected. I'm only stating, if you look into this issue, something that so many people don't even know exists, it starts to open up your field of vision as to just how profoundly those in power could use biowarfare to radically affect their populations, especially in a region that has so much water, with a waterborne parasite, waterborne infections of other types. A lot of possibilities there for a military-industrial complex that clearly does not care for the morality of anything they do at this point. So if you're in Texas or Florida and you see a C-130 flying over your head spraying, and you try to convince yourself it's for your own good, the publicized element they're spraying is lethal enough. And when it gets right down to the bottom line, do you have any clue what they're spraying on you? Any idea at all? You don't. You can tell yourself you do, but again, you don't. In closing, here's the bottom line. The planet and the web of life and human populations are all under assault from countless directions. The criminal cancer that currently controls the world on many levels must be fully exposed and halted. How? By exposing the single greatest and most immediate threat we face short of nuclear cataclysm, because we have no idea what's being sprayed all over the globe every single day as part of the geoengineering solar radiation management programs. What we know is being sprayed from lab tests, again, is toxic enough, just like the NALED. But we don't know what else is in there. And when we have former government scientists like Ken Caldera, whose audio I played on the program, I think a week ago, stating on the record his job was to determine for our government what kinds of pathogens they could spray into clouds to infect the population below. How can we think that there's anything other than nefarious activities going on? Our government spraying NALED on populations is not for their good. Climate engineering spraying toxic particles into the sky, destroying the ozone layer, toxifying every breath we take, is not for our good. We have to face that fact. In regard to stopping the ongoing climate engineering, weather warfare, and biological warfare assault, because that's what it all is. It's killing the planet, again, poisoning every breath we take. There's no easy way forward in this battle. There's no silver bullet. We must reach a critical mass of awareness so that populations all over the globe will be galvanized in a common cause, in a literal fight for life. And the effort to wake the masses will require all of us who are awake already to help sound the alarm. Sharing credible data is crucial, not just any headline or story on the issue that's dangled before us. No, this doesn't help our cause. Rather, again, investigate information, before you share it. Make sure the information is solid and verifiable. Such informational materials are available on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org. Anything less than credible information does great harm to the critical climate engineering cause, exposing it and stopping it, on which all depends. And remember this, when you share credible and verifiable data, expect to be attacked by those who don't, by those who are driven by motives other than a sincere desire to expose the truth for the greater good. We must never yield to such resistance. So stand up, make your voice heard while it can still make a difference. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington with geoengineeringwatch.org.